The today's session will be discussing about user roles. We'll be starting with user roles, and let me open Paint. So guys, we have users and we have permissions as well. So if you are good at Oracle SQL, or if you have already taken Oracle SQL training, you already know that we have permissions inside the database. We have also looked at Oracle namespace yesterday, the user namespace, the different types of limitations a user can have inside the database. Now from one user, like user one, and we have user two, if the user one wants to access the objects of user two, what are the objects inside the database? Like tables, views, triggers, functions, and other objects. So if user one wants to access the user two objects, then the user one needs permissions. Without permissions, user one won't be able to access the objects of the user two. So how do you give permissions to user one? The permissions are given by either by the sys user or object owner. So as sys user, which is the super user, of course you would be able to give the permissions from any object of any user to any other user, or the object owner himself or herself, like user 2, can give the permissions on the tables that are created by the user 2 to any other user, because user 2 is the owner. So let's take EMP is the table and user 2 owns the table. So user 2 can give permissions to other users to access the employee table. And how does the permission is given? So we use grant. That's the command that we use, grant. You specify the permissions on, and then you specify the object. This is the command that you use to give permissions, whether it is select, insert, update, delete, or all. You can use all for all the permissions on a particular object. So if you give grant all, then every permission or every command that the owner of the employee table can execute, the same commands will be applied or allowed to user one to execute on the employee table. So don't try to give this kind of permissions. Make sure, of course, if you're working in real time, your client will tell you what permissions you have to give on a particular object. Now, in a simple database that we are working, it's a test database. It is really simple to grant the permissions. You can grant permission from one user to another user. But when you work in real time, there might be 20 or sometimes more than 80 permissions that you need to give to new users. For example, in a SAP database, we had a user, and every time we used to create the user, like E6P, I'm just giving some example. So if we have a user called E6P, the E6P user was supposed to be given 80 permissions. It becomes very hard, like when you create a new user inside the database, every time you have to execute 80 grant commands, right? Because we have to give 80 permissions, and sometimes you, for 80 permissions, sometimes you have to execute even more than 80 grant commands. It depends. So understand, if we ask you or your client is asking you to create another user inside the database like E6P1, and they ask you to assign all those permissions, it becomes very hard for you to assign those permissions one by one. And you can't always enter 80 to 100 commands again and again in order to assign the permissions. In this case, how do we simplify this? You create roles. So what are roles? Roles are uh, internal to Oracle. It's one name that you can give inside the Oracle database and assign all the 80 permissions. All the 80 permissions you actually assign to a role, and whenever you have a new user inside the database, you assign one single role to the user. So when you assign the role to the user, all the 80 permissions will also follow to the user. This is to simplify how things work inside the database. I'll give you a quick example so that will help you uh, I'll give you a real world example that will help you understand how these things work. So for example, there is a supermarket and you have a sales manager, and then you have billing, right? So these are the real roles on the floor. Like there will be a person for billing, there will be a sales manager, and furthermore. So the billing person should have 20 permissions inside the database. The sales manager should have maybe 70 permissions inside the database, like 70 different permissions on different tables inside the database. So in this case, you might know that in a supermarket there are people who will join and leave, correct? In this case, if people are joining as sales manager and leaving, every time when a new sales manager comes in, you cannot assign 70 permissions. So what you do is you create a role inside the database, and the role name you will give as sales manager. The same way you create another role inside the database and you call it as biller, and then you assign these permissions to the role, the respective roles, right? So whenever, for example, Alex is the person who's joining the supermarket as sales manager. So what you do is you assign the sales manager role to Alex, and Alex will automatically get all the 70 permissions that we gave to the sales manager. So role management is our next topic. This is pretty important when you're working in real time. Of course, the examples that I gave you, this is not the way real time works. Again, there are scenarios and client requirements. It depends. But for now, this is the way you can understand how roles work. So for this, what I did is, I think we already have roles in Oracle. We have an article on roles. Yeah, user roles in Oracle. So if you see this one, when you create a new user, you must at least assign create session privilege so that the user can connect to the database. Remember guys, yesterday we created a new user, but the problem is when you create a new user, the user will not be directly able to access the database, and this is where permissions come into picture. So let me connect to my database. I'll log in as Oracle. ps-ef grep pmon. Okay, testdb is up and running. So let me connect to the database and select username from dba underscore users, where username like usr%. Okay, we have two users, right? So what I would do is, if I remember correctly, we did not assign any permissions to these users, correct? So I don't remember the user one password. So what I would do is I would reset the password, alter user usr1 identified by usr1. That's the password I want to give. And now I will connect the database. So if you're in SQL Plus and you want to switch the user, this is the command that you use. You can type con or connect. So up to you. Then give the username usr1/usr1 and hit enter. Can you see user usr1 lacks create session privilege? So by just creating a user, it does not mean the user will be able to connect to the database. You need to give the create session privilege. And how do you give the privilege? That is what we have described over here. Grant create session to user one. So let us do this. So now if you see you are no longer connected to Oracle, see if you are giving user details which is not able to connect to the user, it does not mean that it falls back to your sys user. Right now you're not connected to the Oracle. That means you need to reconnect to the database. So con slash as sysdba, and then you're connected back to the database as sys user. So show user will show you the username, right? So grant create session to USR1. This is the user and grant is succeeded. Now what I would do is I'll connect to the user one, connect USR1 slash USR1. Can you see show user? Now I am able to connect to the database. So if you're just able to connect to the database, this again does not mean that you will be able to create the data, create the tables or other stuff. Again, for that you still need permissions. So Oracle is very sophisticated when it comes to accessing the database. And like you can see, we just to connect we had to give one permission, right? The same way to create a table we have to give permissions. So in real time the permissions, the number of permissions that you need to assign to a new user is sometimes a big list. So that's the reason what we do is we create roles inside the database, and it makes your life easy that you can assign role to the user. So when you work in real time, there are more than one permission which must be assigned to a user. Sometimes the list might be very big. For example, there is a manager who must be able to perform insert into employee and department table, update the department table, and delete from the bonus table. Like these are the permissions, right? These are the multiple permissions that you must assign to a new manager. So instead of giving above privileges to user one by one, because every time a new manager joins the database, you will have to re-execute these commands. So instead of giving above privileges to the user one by one, we can create a role inside the database. We then assign all the privileges to the role and then assign the role to the user. It makes your life easy. So how do you create a role? The statement is very simple. Create role and give a name to the role, whatever you want to create, like sales manager, or depending on your application, your client might give you to create some different roles. So these kind of jobs are just one time, like first time when you deploy a client, that's the only time you execute these kind of commands. Now, if you see grant the privileges to the role, we created the sales manager role and we are granting all the privileges to the role, not the user. Make sure I made it in capital. Assign all the privileges to the role that you created above, not the user. All right. So we are granting insert on scott.emp to sales manager because as per our client's requirement, we can see that client mentioned they want insert into employee and department table. So grant insert on scott.department to sales manager, then update the department table. So grant update on scott.department to sales manager, and finally delete on bonus. So grant delete on scott.bonus to the sales manager, right? I think this is a great permission because managers are known to delete the bonus. All right. Now you can see that we created a role and we assign all the permissions to the role. Let's take we have a new user who's joining the database, then it makes your life simple. Grant sales manager to user one. So with this one command, all these four privileges are now assigned to the user one. So now you might have question why this kind of thing exists. Because of organization. It organizes your life. For example, let's take you have sales manager, right? So sales manager role is there. So this is role, and sales manager will have multiple permissions. Okay, so over here I'll mention the permissions. So it has insert, update, delete, xyz. All right, and sales manager is assigned to Scott, and then we have another user, ABC, and then we have MNO. These are the users to which we have given the sales manager permissions, right? For the sales manager, now in future, the business requirement changes. The business says that sales manager must also be able to kind of like insert into bonus table. This is the requirement, or the business requirement changes. Now in this case, if you are assigning the individual permissions, then you will have to execute this command for the Scott user, for ABC user, for MNO user. But now that we are using roles inside the database, you have to execute this command only once and assign the permission to the role, and automatically all the users who have the sales manager role, they will get the permission. So this reduces your workload in real time when business requirement changes. Or for example, the client says that, okay, the sales manager must not be able to delete any data. The sales manager must be able to insert, must be able to update the data. Now in this case, what you do is from the sales manager role, you remove the delete permission. So how do you remove the permissions? You use revoke command. Revoke delete on whatever your table is from sales manager, right? If you issue this kind of command, so all the users who have the sales manager role assigned, even they will not have the delete permissions. So for the manageability, easy manageability in your real-time environment, we use roles, and it is very important that you should know how to create a role, how to assign permissions to the role, and how to revoke the permissions to the role. So this activity, guys, I want you to do or execute as your assignment, because this will help you create and play around with the database roles. So try and create as many roles and as possible. Try to assign permissions to the roles and try to revoke the permissions from the role. And as we have already seen how to create new users, you create some new users and then assign the roles to the users, right? So how we can assign the role? We can even take the role away using the revoke command. All right. So guys, any doubts in roles?
Yeah, Arun, one question.
Yes.
Which data dictionary table has that role detail? No? Now, if I want to check what are the roles, what are the privileges that has been assigned to a sales manager?
Right. That's the exactly next article I'm going to talk
Uh,
about.
okay,
Yeah.
okay.
Mhm. So even that is also part of your assignment. All right, so guys, now that when you play around with the users roles and privileges, the question that Satish just asked, that's the same question you all will have. Like, how do you know which permission is assigned to which role and which role is assigned to the user? So if you look at the hierarchy, just to reiterate, you have permissions, permission 1, permission 2, permission 3, and so on, permission 100. All right, you have permissions. Permissions are assigned to role, and then role is assigned to a user, right? So there must be some base tables or views that allow you to look at the relation between the permissions and roles and user, like which role is assigned to the user, and also which permission is assigned to the user, correct? And definitely we do have these kind of views. So we again have a great article on it. If you just type roles, can you see check user roles and privileges? So this article speaks about how do you check the roles granted to a user, privileges that are granted to a user, privileges that are granted to a role, if you have delegated any system privileges to a user, and what are the permissions that are granted to a role. So we have all the commands in this one article that you can use. So Satish, I think these commands will help you find any detail about any type of permissions inside the database.
Thanks, Arun.
Right. So guys, this is something I want you guys to try it out in your practice, because these are very simple commands, very simple things. If you are working with roles, always remember this diagram in your head. We have permissions, permissions are assigned to role, and role is assigned to a user. And this is how the real time works. You do not assign permissions directly to a user, all right? Because it helps you standardize the system access. And this is the reason I'm not going over all these commands. I want you guys to execute, play around with these things as much as possible, because these are not so critical. All right, so with the role management,
Aaron,
yes, Ibay.
yeah, given that the permissions are on tables, the database that we installed, does it have like dummy tables that it already come with that we can play with?
I think if you have created like me, like when I created in the silent mode,
Mm-hmm.
we did not choose the dummy tables. So what you can do is delete the database if you don't have the dummy schemas, and create it via the DBCA. And in the DBCA, if you remember, I showed you one checkbox which you have
Yes.
to select in order to create the sample schemas. So
Yes.
do that, and then you can play around with the permissions.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Right. I would personally suggest don't depend on the sample schema. I want you to create new users, create tables yourself, and then give permissions. That way you have more hold on the database.
Okay.